Around the year 1400, in the dry and elevated landscape of what is now southwestern Colorado, human settlement did not merely adapt to stone, it reshaped it. High above the canyon floor, where gravity dominates every movement and error is punished immediately, people transformed sheer granite cliffs into complete architectural environments. These were not crude shelters wedged into cracks by chance. They were composed spaces built with intent, proportion, and repetition, where stone blocks weighing many tons were positioned with a precision that leaves little room for improvisation. Each block sits where it must, aligned with others, locked into walls that have resisted centuries of erosion, temperature swings, and abandonment. And yet, by every conventional measure, these stones should never have been there. There were no wheeled vehicles rolling across the plateau, no draft animals hauling sledges uphill, no metal tools recorded that would easily cut, shape, and transport granite at such scale. The technological inventory normally attributed to the people of this region speaks of stone tools, wooden implements, fiber ropes, and human muscle. It does not speak of cranes, pulleys, or mechanical advantage systems capable of lifting massive stone blocks vertically and placing them onto narrow ledges carved into cliff faces. And yet, the evidence does not negotiate. The stone is present. The architecture exists. The walls stand where they were set. There was no sudden catastrophe forcing people to flee upward into the cliffs in panic. No documented invasion that would explain a desperate rush to inaccessible heights. No geological event that made the canyon floor uninhabitable overnight. The construction appears deliberate, measured, and sustained over time. Stone by stone, wall by wall, space by space, these structures were assembled in locations where the cost of every decision was higher than it would have been on open ground. The choice to build here was not reactive, it was intentional. What creates unease is not the existence of the dwellings themselves, but the absence of an explanation that fully accounts for how they came to be. Granite does not forgive mistakes. It does not float into position. It must be quarried, shaped, moved, lifted, and set. Each step demands planning, coordination, and a clear understanding of forces that cannot be wished away. When such material appears high on a cliff face, neatly integrated into architecture that shows consistency rather than improvisation, it challenges the boundaries of what is usually considered possible for societies described as technologically modest. The discomfort does not arise from mystery in the theatrical sense. It arises from a mismatch between inputs and outputs. If the inputs are as limited as the standard narrative suggests, then the outputs should reflect those limits. But here, the outputs exceed expectation. The stones remain heavy and unmoved by time, while the explanations offered to account for them often feel lighter than the material they attempt to describe. The question does not demand an extraordinary answer. It demands a sufficient one. And until such an answer fully closes the gap between what was available and what was achieved, the stone at Mesa Verde continues to sit where, by logic alone, it should not be. To understand why Mesa Verde unsettles so deeply, one must first understand what history expects to find when it looks at societies of the American Southwest around the 14th century. The prevailing model describes the ancestral Pueblo peoples as communities organized around agriculture, ritual, and kinship rather than centralized political authority. They are often portrayed as living in dispersed settlements, adapting skillfully to arid environments through dry farming, water management, and seasonal movement. Their technological profile emphasizes efficiency rather than excess. Stone tools carefully shaped for specific purposes, wooden beams harvested from distant forests, baskets woven with precision, and ceramics fired with controlled heat but without industrial infrastructure. Within this framework, architecture is understood as functional and symbolic, but rarely as mechanically ambitious. Buildings are said to grow incrementally, responding to social needs and environmental constraints rather than grand plans. Construction is assumed to favor what is locally available and easily manageable, minimizing unnecessary labor. The absence of wheeled transport is not treated as a deficiency, but as a defining boundary condition. Movement of heavy materials is assumed to be limited, and therefore architecture is expected to reflect that limitation through scale, placement, and material choice. In this model, granite is a challenging material. It is harder to shape than sandstone, heavier to move, less forgiving to work with using stone tools alone. When large granite blocks appear in architecture, the expectation is that they were either used close to where they were found or incorporated in ways that did not require lifting them far or high. The model assumes that effort follows necessity and necessity follows practicality. There is little room in this narrative for moving massive stone blocks to precarious locations unless survival absolutely demands it. Mesa Verde complicates this expectation. The cliff dwellings do not simply use small stones gathered nearby, they incorporate substantial blocks arranged in walls that show standardization rather than improvisation. Angles repeat, courses align. Openings are consistent in size and placement. This suggests planning beyond immediate need. It suggests that builders knew not only what they wanted to create, but also how to repeat it reliably across multiple structures and sites. The standard model does not deny intelligence or skill. It praises adaptation and resilience, but it implicitly limits organizational reach. It assumes that without centralized authority, written plans or advanced tools, large-scale coordinated engineering would be impractical. Mesa Verde sits uncomfortably within that assumption. It does not reject the model outright, but it stretches it, forcing questions about how much coordination, foresight, and technical understanding can exist without leaving behind the kinds of records modern historians are accustomed to using as proof. What history expects then is modesty of means matched by modesty of results. Mesa Verde presents modest means paired with results that feel anything but modest. The dwellings do not merely contradict expectations, they expose how narrow those expectations may be. They suggest that the absence of certain technologies does not necessarily equate to the absence of complex problem solving. And that organization does not always announce itself through monuments easily classified by familiar categories. In this tension between expectation and evidence, the stones begin to speak more loudly than the models designed to contain them. It is tempting to describe the structures of Mesa Verde as shelters, as if they were little more than opportunistic uses of natural alcoves. But such language collapses under closer examination. These were not temporary refuges assembled in haste. They were architectural compositions shaped by intention and governed by internal logic. The cliff dwellings reveal planning that extends beyond survival and into design. Walls rise vertically with disciplined regularity. Corners meet at angles that require foresight, not chance. Rooms align with one another in ways that suggest an understanding of space as something to be organized rather than merely occupied. Openings are placed with consistency, allowing light and movement while preserving structural integrity. The use of mortar, the selection of stone sizes, and the layering of materials all point toward construction practices refined through experience and shared knowledge. What distinguishes these structures is not just their location, but their coherence. Individual dwellings are part of larger complexes, connected physically and visually. They form clusters that imply social organization and shared standards. The repetition of forms across different sites indicates that builders were not inventing solutions anew each time. They were applying a known system, adapting it to specific conditions while maintaining recognizable patterns. Granite, in this context, is not merely a material. It is a commitment. To choose such stone is to accept the labor it demands, from extraction to placement. It is to favor durability over convenience, permanence over speed. The builders did not rely solely on stones that conveniently fell from the cliff above. They selected, shaped, and positioned material in ways that imply control over supply and process. This level of architectural intent challenges the idea that Mesa Verde represents a marginal or transitional phase. It suggests a society capable of sustaining long-term projects, coordinating labor over extended periods, and transmitting construction knowledge across generations. The cliff dwellings were not accidents of geography. They were solutions crafted in dialogue with a difficult environment, requiring an understanding of forces, materials, and human coordination that exceeds what is often attributed to societies without written records or mechanical technology. In these structures, stone becomes language. Each block tells of decisions made and constraints overcome. Each wall records not only human presence, but human planning. To call these places shelters is to miss their significance. They are architecture in the full sense of the word, shaped by intention, refined through practice, and executed under conditions that amplify every challenge. And it is precisely because they are architecture rather than mere refuge that the question of how their stones came to be where they are remains unresolved, pressing quietly against the edges of accepted explanation. Granite is not a forgiving material. It is dense, crystalline, and stubbornly resistant to change. Unlike softer stone that can be chipped, trimmed, or adjusted with relative ease, granite demands force, patience, and precision at every stage. Its compressive strength is high, its fracture patterns unpredictable, and its mass unavoidably heavy. When granite appears in architecture, it announces a decision to accept difficulty rather than avoid it. At Mesa Verde, that decision is written into every wall. Even modest granite blocks weigh hundreds of kilograms. Larger stones used in load-bearing walls can reach weights measured in tons. This is not speculation, it is arithmetic. Volume multiplied by density produces numbers that cannot be argued away by narrative convenience. A block the size of a small refrigerator, cut from granite, can exceed what a single humana, even several, can safely lift, maneuver, and place without mechanical advantage. Multiply this by dozens or hundreds of stones across multiple structures, and the problem ceases to be anecdotal, it becomes systemic. The material choice compounds the challenge. Granite is not easily shaped with stone tools alone. The marks left on Mesa Verde blocks indicate repeated, controlled impacts rather than casual breakage. Surfaces meet cleanly enough to accept mortar and distribute load. This implies time invested not just in moving stone, but in preparing it time that could have been saved by choosing lighter, more cooperative materials. The builders did not simply use what was easiest. They used what would last. Gravity, meanwhile, is impartial. It does not reward intention. It does not negotiate with culture. A granite block resists movement equally whether carried by modern machinery or human hands. To move it requires overcoming inertia, friction, and slope. To lift it requires converting horizontal effort into vertical work, multiplying difficulty at each meter of elevation. The energy cost is measurable and severe. What makes this material problem so pressing at Mesa Verde is not that granite exists there, it does, but that it exists in quantities and placements that exceed what simple transport explanations comfortably support. If the stones had been rolled short distances on flat ground, the challenge would be significant but plausible. If they had been stacked at ground level, difficulty would still exist, but gravity would at least be neutral. Instead, granite appears embedded in cliffside architecture, where every kilogram must be lifted, stabilized, and held in place long enough to become part of a permanent structure. This is where the narrative strain becomes audible. The standard explanations, human chains, wooden levers, ropes, are not wrong in principle. They are simply incomplete in scale. Such methods can move stone, but not easily, not repeatedly, and not to heights where error is catastrophic. The material itself refuses to be minimized. Granite does not allow itself to be explained away. It remains heavy, unyielding, and insistently present, demanding an account that respects its physical reality rather than sidestepping it. Weight alone is a challenge. Weight combined with height is an entirely different problem. At Mesa Verde, the architecture does not rest on forgiving terrain. It clings to vertical faces, tucked into alcoves that offer shelter but little working room. The cliffs rise abruptly, their surfaces uneven, and their ledges narrow. There is no broad platform on which to stage materials, no open yard for trial and error. Every movement occurs within constraints that magnify risk. To build at height is to accept gravity as an adversary rather than a background condition. Lifting stone upward requires not only strength, but control. A drop block does not merely fall, it accelerates, shatters, and potentially kills. The higher the placement, the greater the consequence of misjudgment. This reality forces methodical behavior, it discourages improvisation, it demands planning before action, sequence before effort. The placement of granite blocks at Mesa Verde suggests that such planning existed. Stones are not simply lodged where they landed, they are set into walls with alignment and intention. Courses follow one another predictably. Openings are framed with heavier stones placed where compressive forces concentrate. This is not the result of carrying stone up first and deciding later where it might fit. It implies that space was defined in advance, that builders knew where walls would rise and what loads they would carry before the stones arrived. This raises a central question that resists easy answers. Were the stones moved into position after the spaces were defined, or were spaces carved and adapted around stones that had already been brought up? Each scenario presents its own difficulties. Moving stone after defining space requires precise vertical transport into confined areas. Moving stone first requires confidence that it will later fit a planned structure without the luxury of adjustment. Either way, the challenge remains. Granite blocks were lifted to heights where gravity offers no assistance and little forgiveness. The working environment was constrained, the material unforgiving, and the margin for error minimal. Yet the result shows no signs of desperate correction. Walls do not sag. Corners do not betray last-minute compromises. The structures appear calm, as if gravity had been accounted for rather than fought impulsively. Height transforms material effort into organizational effort. It requires not just people, but coordination. Someone must direct, others must stabilize, still others must prepare the next step. Timing matters, sequence matters. Knowledge must be shared, not discovered mid-action. The cliff dwellings embody this discipline. Their stones rest not where gravity would allow them to fall, but where human planning placed them in defiance of vertical constraint. The question is not whether this could be done, but how often, how consistently, and by what system it was achieved. Transportation is the silent backbone of architecture. Without a reliable way to move materials, even the most elegant design remains theoretical. At Mesa Verde, transport must be considered in the absence of technologies that modern observers instinctively rely upon. There were no wheeled carts traversing the plateau, no sledges sliding across snow, no large domesticated animals bred for hauling heavy loads. Movement depended almost entirely on human bodies, ropes, and the terrain itself. This absence does not make transport impossible, but it makes it costly. Carrying heavy stone by hand over uneven ground demands enormous energy. Repetition magnifies fatigue. Distance compounds risk. Every step becomes a calculation between progress and exhaustion. When transport includes elevation change, ascending cliffs, or navigating narrow paths, the difficulty increases exponentially. Various possibilities have been proposed. Stones could have been dragged on wooden frames, carried by teams using poles, or rolled short distances on logs. Ropes could have been used to hoist blocks incrementally, anchoring them to natural features. None of these methods are implausible in isolation. The problem arises when they are asked to explain sustained large-scale construction using heavy granite at height. No single model accounts for the consistency observed across multiple structures. Temporary solutions leave traces, ramps, anchor points, staging areas that would likely appear in the archaeological record if used extensively. Yet such evidence is limited or ambiguous. The transport problem, like the material problem, does not collapse under scrutiny. It remains stubbornly present. What complicates matters further is efficiency. Transport methods that work once or twice under extreme effort do not scale well. A society does not build multiple cliff dwellings by repeating near impossible feats unless those feats are systematized. That implies routines, shared knowledge, and methods refined through repetition. The absence of wheels does not negate this possibility, but it raises the threshold of explanation. Transport without wheels forces reliance on geometry, leverage, and coordination. It rewards planning over improvisation. It favors routes chosen not for convenience, but for control. At Mesa Verde, stone appears to have arrived not haphazardly, but reliably. This reliability suggests that transport was not an afterthought, but an integrated part of the construction process. The discomfort lies in the gap between what is required and what is recorded. We know people moved the stone because the stone is there. We know the environment resisted them because gravity and mass are constants. What we do not fully know is how transport was made routine rather than heroic. Until that routine is clearly articulated, transport remains one of the most significant unanswered questions embedded in the cliff walls themselves. Tools leave signatures. They mark stone, shape surfaces, and encode methods into material. At Mesa Verde, the marks left on granite blocks tell a story of control rather than brute force. Surfaces are not wildly fractured. Edges are not purely accidental. The stones show evidence of repeated, deliberate shaping that exceeds what casual hammering would produce. The recorded tool set of the ancestral Puebloans includes stone hammers, pecking tools, wooden implements, and abrasive techniques using sand and water. These tools can shape stone. Given enough time, they can produce smooth surfaces and controlled edges. What they do not easily explain is the uniformity and precision observed across large granite blocks used in structurally critical positions. Precision implies measurement. It implies repeatability. It implies an understanding of how stone will behave under load. These are not abstract concepts. They are practical necessities when building with heavy material in precarious locations. A misjudged cut can weaken a block, an uneven surface can concentrate stress, an imprecise placement can destabilize an entire wall. The techniques inferred from the finished architecture suggest more than ad hoc experimentation. They suggest standards. Stones fit where they are placed because they were prepared to fit. Mortar fills gaps that were anticipated, not discovered. The relationship between tool and result feels tighter than the recorded tool set alone would predict. This does not mean that unknown tools must be invoked. It means that the known tools may have been used with a level of skill, organization, and procedural knowledge that is rarely emphasized. The limitation may not be technological, but documentary. Without written records, technique must be inferred backward from outcome. When the outcome is more refined than expected, the inference becomes uncomfortable. The limits of what is recorded are not proof of absence, but they are boundaries of confidence. We know what tools have been found. We know what marks they can leave. What remains uncertain is how knowledge of technique was structured, transmitted, and preserved. Was there specialization? Were certain individuals responsible for stone preparation while others handled placement? Were methods standardized across generations? Mesa Verde does not answer these questions directly. It poses them silently through stone surfaces that reflect intent and competence. The granite does not announce how it was shaped. It only shows that it was shaped well enough to endure. In that endurance lies the tension between what we can describe and what we can fully explain. The tools we recognize may be sufficient in principle, but the results they produced suggest a mastery that challenges the boundaries of the record. At a certain scale, labor stops being a question of strength and becomes a question of structure. Mesa Verde crosses that threshold decisively. The stones embedded in its walls are not the product of a few determined individuals acting independently. Their number, their placement, and their consistency imply coordination that extends beyond household or seasonal cooperation. Moving granite at this scale requires more than willing hands. It requires a system capable of synchronizing effort across time and space, ensuring that energy is applied where it matters and withheld where it would be wasted. To lift a single heavy stone into a cliff alcove demands many people acting in concert. Some must pull, others must stabilize, others must guide. The moment one group falters, the entire effort risks failure. Now multiply this requirement across dozens of stones, across multiple structures, across years of construction. The image that emerges is not one of spontaneous communal effort, but of organized labor governed by shared protocols. People must arrive at the right place at the right time with the right tools, performing the right task in a sequence that others understand. This is management, even if it leaves no written trace. Such organization implies roles. Not everyone can be lifting stone at once. Some must prepare materials, others must maintain pathways, others must ensure safety. Food must be produced to sustain workers who are not engaged in subsistence activities. Children must be cared for. Knowledge must be transmitted so that mistakes are not repeated. The act of moving stone thus becomes embedded in a broader social framework that prioritizes continuity over improvisation. What is striking is the apparent absence of excess. The stones are not piled randomly. They are not overused or underused. Walls are thick enough to endure, but not gratuitously massive. This suggests planning informed by experience. Someone knew how much labor a task would require and judged it worthwhile. Someone knew when to stop. These judgments imply authority, not necessarily hierarchical domination, but the ability to coordinate collective action toward a shared goal. Mesa Verde's architecture therefore reflects not just physical skill, but social intelligence. It encodes decisions about labor allocation, risk tolerance, and long-term investment. The community accepted the cost of moving stone upward because the outcome justified it. That acceptance could only exist if the process was reliable enough to succeed repeatedly. A society that gambles blindly with human effort does not produce stable architecture. It produces ruins of failure. Mesa Verde produces ruins of success. In this sense, stone movement becomes a lens through which the society itself comes into focus. The cliffs are not merely a backdrop. They are constraints that force clarity. To build here is to organize. To organize here is to reveal a social system capable of sustained, disciplined cooperation. The stones did not move themselves. They moved because society knew how to move them, again and again, without collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Comparison is often used to make the unfamiliar comfortable. By placing a site alongside others, historians seek patterns that reduce anomaly. Mesa Verde resists this impulse. When compared to other societies that lacked wheels, large draft animals, or metal tools, its architecture does not settle neatly into established categories. Cliff dwellings exist elsewhere, but rarely with the same combination of material weight, vertical placement, and architectural refinement. Earthworks are common in some cultures, stone construction in others. Mesa Verde occupies a narrow intersection where these traditions overlap but do not fully explain one another. In societies without wheels, heavy construction is typically grounded. Stone is stacked where gravity assists, not where it must be overcome. Where vertical building occurs, materials are often lighter or sourced immediately adjacent to the site. At Mesa Verde, granite appears in places where neither convenience nor necessity demands it. This is not an isolated instance of ingenuity under pressure. It is a repeated pattern across multiple dwellings, suggesting that the approach was normative rather than exceptional. Looking beyond North America, parallels remain elusive. In regions with monumental stone architecture, wheels or animals are often present, or terrain allows for ramps and gradual elevation.
In regions with cliff habitation, structures tend to be carved from the rock itself rather than assembled from transported blocks. Mesa Verde blends carving and construction in a way that complicates simple classification.
This lack of direct parallel does not imply uniqueness in an absolute sense. Human societies have repeatedly found creative solutions to material challenges. What it does imply is that Mesa Verde's solutions emerged from a specific convergence of environment, knowledge, and social organization that has not been widely replicated. The comparison problem is therefore not a failure of imagination, but a signal that existing categories may be insufficient. When a site cannot be comfortably compared, it forces a reassessment of assumptions. Perhaps societies labeled as technologically simple are capable of more complex achievements than our frameworks allow. Perhaps the absence of certain tools does not preclude the development of sophisticated methods. Mesa Verde stands as a reminder that comparison can illuminate, but it can also obscure when used to enforce expectations rather than explore possibilities. The end of Mesa Verde is as quiet as its construction was deliberate. The dwellings were not destroyed. The walls were not toppled. The stones remain where they were placed, aligned and stable, as if awaiting return. There is no evidence of widespread violence, no layer of ash signaling catastrophe. Instead, there is absence. People left and stones stayed. This form of abandonment raises a final, unsettling question. When a society capable of organizing such complex construction departs without dismantling its work, what happens to the knowledge embedded in that work? Stone walls do not teach themselves. Techniques not recorded must be practiced to survive. When practitioners leave or disperse, their methods fade, even if their structures endure. The disappearance of the builders severs the link between process and product. Later generations encounter the result without access to the system that produced it. Over time, explanation gives way to speculation. The knowledge of how to move granite upward without wheels becomes invisible, not because it was secret, but because it was never externalized beyond practice. Mesa Verde thus becomes a paradox frozen in place. It is a site of immense effort that ends without drama. Its stones testify to capability, but not continuity. The society that moved them chose, or was forced, to move on. Whatever reasons lay behind that decision, the consequence is clear. The techniques that once made the improbable routine were not carried forward in a way that history could easily follow. Standing beneath the cliffs, one confronts architecture without its instruction manual. The stones still resist gravity. the walls still hold, but the pathway by which they came to be is broken not by destruction, but by departure. Mesa Verde does not collapse into myth. It remains stubbornly real, quietly insisting that human capability can exceed the categories used to describe it, and that when knowledge is not preserved, even the most solid achievements can become questions without answers. What remains at Mesa Verde is not confusion, but silence of a very specific kind. There are no indigenous texts describing how stone was moved, shaped, or lifted into place. No diagrams scratched into walls. No symbolic sequences that clearly encode construction methods. The absence is not selective, it is total. The society that left behind these structures did not externalize its technical knowledge in a form that survived separation from its people. What we inherit is outcome without annotation. This gap matters because it places a hard limit on explanation. Archaeology excels at reading material traces, but material alone cannot fully describe process. From stone and mortar, we can infer sequence, estimate labor, reconstruct tools within probability, but inference has boundaries. When the results exceed the expected capabilities implied by the known toolkit, explanation stalls. Mesa Verde sits precisely at that boundary. The stones are heavier than what casual transport would allow. The placements are more precise than what improvisation would reliably achieve. Yet there is no written corrective to guide interpretation when assumptions fail. The lack of records has often been reframed as cultural difference, as if the absence of writing automatically explains the absence of documentation. But this explanation is incomplete. Many non-literate societies preserved complex technical knowledge through oral transmission, ritualized practice, and apprenticeship systems robust enough to endure for centuries. The problem at Mesa Verde is not that knowledge was unwritten, but that it was not transferred forward after abandonment. The chain broke. When it broke, the instructions vanished even as the results remained. This creates an asymmetry between confidence and caution. Modern observers are confident in describing what Mesa Verde was not. It was not built with wheels. It was not built with metal tools comparable to later industrial methods. It was not constructed by draft animals hauling stone up engineered ramps. These negatives are well supported. What remains uncertain is what it was built with. Rope systems, leverage strategies, incremental placement, seasonal coordination, scaffold structures anchored into the cliff. Each is plausible in isolation. None fully accounts for the totality of evidence when scale, height, weight, and repetition are considered together. The record gap thus becomes a datum rather than a failure. It tells us something important about how history filters achievement. Societies that record their methods are legible long after they vanish. Societies that embed their knowledge entirely in practice become opaque the moment practice ends. Mesa Verde belongs to the latter category. Its builders solved problems in ways that worked, but did not leave a transferable archive of how they solved them. The stones therefore function as a test of our explanatory models. When those models cannot bridge the gap between known tools and observed results, the gap itself becomes evidence that the model is incomplete. This does not require mystery. It requires humility. The absence of instructions does not imply impossibility, but it does constrain certainty. Mesa Verde forces recognition that technological capability cannot be measured solely by the presence or absence of familiar tools. It can be encoded in organization, in time management, in ritual discipline, in methods that leave no durable trace beyond their success. When those methods disappear, the architecture becomes a question posed to the future. Mesa Verde does not demand extraordinary explanations. It does not require appeals to lost continents or external intervention. What it requires is attention to weight, height, and consequence. Granite weighs what it weighs. Gravity behaves as it always has. Human bodies exert finite force. These constants do not bend to narrative convenience. They are the fixed parameters within which any explanation must operate. The stones remain where they were placed, embedded in walls that cling to cliffs long after their builders departed. They have not drifted downward. They have not collapsed under their own mass. They persist as physical facts, indifferent to interpretation. Each block asserts the same quiet statement. It was moved. It was lifted. It was set with intent. No amount of cultural minimization alters that reality. Mesa Verde therefore stands as a reminder of a broader pattern. History often measures societies by what they leave behind in texts and symbols. But some achievements resist that metric. They are preserved not in words, but in mass. When such societies dissolve or migrate, their accomplishments remain stripped of explanation but not of substance. The result is not mystery in the sensational sense, but tension in the analytical one. The evidence is sufficient to demand explanation, but insufficient to complete it. This tension should not be resolved by reduction. Calling the stone symbolic avoids the physics. Calling the architecture simple avoids the logistics. Calling the society unsophisticated avoids the organization implied by the work. Mesa Verde asks for a different response. It asks for models that take seriously the possibility of complex problem solving emerging without the tools we expect to see and without the records we expect to read. The weight that remains is therefore not only physical, it is intellectual. It presses against assumptions about technological progression and cultural capability. It suggests that knowledge can be deeply effective without being permanently transmissible, and that disappearance does not require failure. A society can solve its problems well enough to build in stone and still leave history uncertain about how it did so. Mesa Verde does not need to be elevated beyond humanity to be impressive. It only needs to be taken on its own terms. Stone was moved upward without wheels. Precision was achieved without metal. Organization was sustained without bureaucracy. These are not miracles. They are accomplishments whose methods were bound to people rather than paper. Some achievements vanish when their builders leave. Others remain heavy and silent, forcing history to admit it does not yet know how they were done.